This is the story of the single wing offense. You may have never heard of it, or if you have, it's only been in reference to youth football. We're going to discuss the invention of the single wing, its greatest moments, including coaches and players, and we'll discuss its demise. Then, at the end of the video, we're going to show some footage of the single wing offense in action so you can see how they played football in those days. I'll be adding chapters to this video so you can hop around easily if you like. The single wing was an offense invented early in history that went on to dominate football for nearly 40 years and gave birth to some of the greatest innovations in football history. I've never found a formation that better demonstrates how innovations happened in sports. The story of the single wing is really the story of football itself. Let's start in the early 1900s. Football was a brutal game of mass play, with teams at times literally picking up and carrying the ball carriers forward. The forward pass wasn't legal then. Enter Glenn Pop Warner at the Carlisle Indian School, a man who would revolutionize football. In fact, I have a full video about Warner and how he himself caused more rule changes than any other coach in history. Warner developed the single wing formation around 1906 to 1908, maybe later, the exact date is debated, and it was first referred to as the Carlisle formation by Walter Camp, the father of American football. It was called the Z formation by Warner himself early on. What made it revolutionary was how it combined power, deception, and tactical innovation in ways that no one had seen before. The forward pass had just been legalized in 1906, and Warner, while at Carlisle, was one of the first to utilize it as an offensive weapon. This is the base single wing formation. An unbalanced offensive line, more players on one side of the center than the other. Behind them, four backs arranged in what looks like, a wing. The key player was the tailback, lined up a few yards behind the center. He was called the tailback because he was the deepest man in the backfield. He lined up directly behind the center, sometimes slightly to the left or right, dependent upon how a coach favored the formation. The tailback was vital because he usually handled the ball most of the time. The key to being good was having a tailback that was a triple threat, meaning that he could run, pass, and kick effectively. The quarterback in the single wing wasn't actually the primary ball handler. He was mainly a blocking back and the play caller. When people talk about how the quarterback position has evolved over the years, they usually don't realize just how dramatically that evolution is. Another important point about the invention of the single wing: most of the formations that preceded it focused on placing power in the backfield. Formations such as guards back or tackles back were prominent. As examples, examine these diagrams from Amos Alonzo Stagg and Dr. Henry Williams' book, A Scientific and Practical Treatise on Football from 1894. Note that there are only 5 players on the line. Little about these plays is legal in today's football world because these types of plays killed people until outlawed by rules changes from 1906 to 1912 that required more players on the line of scrimmage, culminating with 7 players required on the line of scrimmage in modern football. The single wing not only fit in with the old style, but was flexible enough to flow with the changes and remain relevant for decades. A key element of the single wing is misdirection. The single wing's hallmark was its ability to confuse defenses. By faking handoffs, reverses, and lateral plays, offenses could manipulate defenders into overcommitting to the wrong side of the play. We have this standard or common idea about how offense in football is supposed to work. The quarterback passes the ball, running backs run the ball, and fullbacks block and maybe sometimes catch a pass. In the single wing, anyone can throw, anyone can block, anyone can run, and all 4 backs are used to run the ball. Overall, the single wing's base concept is to overwhelm the point of attack with lots of blockers, unbalanced sets, then use misdirection and fakes to hide the ball and keep the defense honest. The unbalanced line, if the coach chooses to use one, creates favorable blocking angles, allowing teams to overwhelm defenses on the strong side with sheer force. The fullback, often used as a lead blocker, amplified the offense's power running capabilities. Now, I should mention that Warner invented the single wing somewhat out of necessity. The Carlisle Indians were smaller, but faster and more agile than their opponents, and during Warner's tenure, they went around playing the best teams in the nation on the road. Deception and misdirection were beautiful, amazing tools that won them many games, much to the chagrin of their opponents, especially when everyone else was just smashing the ball ahead into the line. Now, Warner later created a successor to the single wing called the double wing. There's the shock. The double wing, in contrast, placed wingbacks on both sides of the formation, each positioned behind and outside the tight ends. This created a more balanced attack, allowing teams to run effectively to either side. The quarterback, or blocking back, was typically closer to the line than in the single wing, and the fullback lined up directly behind them. A key difference is that the single wing was built around one dominant ball carrier, the tailback, while the double wing distributed the running responsibilities more evenly between multiple backs. The double wing also tended to feature more misdirection plays, using the balanced formation to keep defenses guessing at which side the play would develop. One more interesting item about Warner's formations. The single wing wasn't called single wing until Princeton coach Bill Roper referred to it as such in articles in 1928. Meanwhile, Pop Warner first used the term double wing in the early 1930s, although he had used the formation at Stanford in the 1920s. Before that, Warner called the double wing Formation B and the single wing Formation A. Can you imagine a coach waiting 2 decades to actually brand and market his idea, especially as popular as Warner's was? The single wing produced some of the greatest coaches, players, and games in football history. In 1912, Warner takes the Carlisle Indians and defeats mighty Army, 27-6, using his single wing offense, along with a guy that many might think might be the greatest athlete of all time, Jim Thorpe. If you stop and think about the cultural significance of that game for the moment, and that it might be one of the biggest upsets in history, the Carlisle Indians might be the best story in the history of college football. The following year, 1913, a tiny little Midwestern school no one had ever heard of, Notre Dame, with 2 guys that no one had ever heard of, Gus Duras and Newt Rockne, and they beat Army 35-13, using the forward pass and the single wing in what might be the most important football game in history. Red Grange, known as the Galloping Ghost, used the formation's misdirection principles to revolutionize broken field running. Bronko Nagurski, Ernie Nevers, Niall Kinnick, Tom Harmon, Paul Gill, and Charlie Choo Choo Justice at North Carolina all made their fame with the single wing. Dick Kazmaier was the last single wing player to win the Heisman Trophy in 1951 at Princeton. His coach said defenders would tackle 3 different players on a single play, none of whom had the ball. Coaches across the nation put their own spin on the formation. General Robert Neyland at Tennessee, general because he had reached the rank of brigadier general in the Army, used a balanced line version that emphasized power running. Fritz Crisler at Michigan added pre-snap shifts in motion to create confusion. UCLA's Red Sanders combined aspects of the single wing with the short punt formation to create a hybrid that remained effective into the 1960s. West Coast teams often ran a more wide-open version with more passing. Southeastern teams preferred a power running approach. Bernie Bierman's Minnesota teams won 5 national championships between 1934 and 1941 with their version, which featured power over misdirection. Even internationally, Japanese teams developed a quick-hitting version suited to smaller players, while Canadian teams spread the formation wider to use their broader field. But like all great inventions, the single wing's dominance wouldn't last forever. The turning point came in 1940 when two games changed football history. First, Clark Shaughnessy's Stanford Indian team, running a modernized T formation, surprised the football world by dismantling Nebraska 21-13 in the 1941 Rose Bowl. And then the Chicago Bears used the same formation, as Shaughnessy was an advisor to Bears owner George Halas, to destroy the Washington Redskins 73-0 in the NFL championship. By the 1950s, most teams had abandoned the single wing for the T formation. The holdouts were few. Princeton, Tennessee, and UCLA kept it into the early 1960s. Princeton was the last major college running it, finally abandoning it in 1969. But here's the fascinating thing: the single wing never really died. Keith Piper, who ran the single wing at Denison University into the 1990s, put it perfectly. No one ever really caught up with or passed the single wing offense. It just went out of style. The single wing wasn't replaced because it stopped working. It was replaced because something new came along. But its principles, deception, power, versatility, those are forever and they live on in modern football. The Wildcat formation, which became popular starting in 2006 at Arkansas, with Darren McFadden taking direct snaps as a running back, is an offshoot of the single wing. They called it the wild hog formation at times. Next time you watch a quarterback run an RPO or a running back take a direct snap, remember that you're watching the ghost of Pop Warner's creation, still influencing football more than a century later. We're going to take a look at some single wing examples so you can get an idea of what the offense looked like. This is not an analysis. I'm not going to do that on this channel. I'm not the best player breaker down guy. This is about seeing what football looked like back in the day or how different teams and coaches did different things. I love this offense. I love the crisscross plays, as they were called, and especially the spinner series. The first couple plays we're going to look at come from Penn State, and they have decent audio. These are from the Penn State University archives, so I've kept the audio intact.
There he goes. It's Bill Denise in a naked reverse that would put Gypsy Rose Lee to shame. Not a hand touches the linebacker as he races across the goal line for one of 3 touchdowns against Syracuse. And this year is no exception. That's Windy Weir, one of State's great bantam backs, taking the ball from center, going back, and then racing forward before he tosses a long pass to Joe Odessa on the 1. Score a moment later helps the Lions nose out Bucknell 20-14.
Next play is 1937. Notice that the center snapped to a moving target, and it's a beautiful off-tackle play. The next set is from the 1939 Orange Bowl, Tennessee versus Oklahoma. General Robert Neyland at Tennessee used what was referred to as a side saddle quarterback. Now, these clips come from the College Football Historians channel here on YouTube. Now, the side saddle quarterback just looks like he's almost hiding. And you can see on some plays that he looks like he's going to take the ball, but on none of the plays I watched did I ever see him take it. 1937 Northwestern, you can see the spin as the misdirection, as both that would be referred to as a crisscross plays in the beginning days of the single wing offense. Next up is 1945 Michigan versus Ohio State, with several different types of plays that I found interesting. I tried using artificial intelligence to clean up and some of this footage to make it more crisp, but all I ended up with was a bunch of glowing objects running around a field. It took a lot of time and it was very disappointing. On this next play, you're going to see a very beautiful setup with a pop or jump pass out of the single wing. And here we see a pre-snap shift from the T formation into the single wing by Ohio State, and then a beautiful long pass that's intercepted by Michigan. For all the running around in this game that you can watch the College Football Historians channel, the game was won by Michigan 7-3. And then we're going to move into something more modern. A Kansas City Chiefs play with a direct snap to Isaiah Pacheco, who scores. Next up is another Kansas City play against the 49ers. The spin at the beginning of this play is for show. And it's really, I think, set up to kind of confuse the defense, or maybe it's an homage to Pop Warner. I'm not really sure. I didn't go look that up. But again, it's a very beautiful option out to the right. So the linebackers in the backfield have to respect that option movement, and it opens up the middle. And there you go. And those are some of the single wing plays that I spent way too much time watching and trying to find in decent resolution so that you could actually see what the offense looked like, because there's a lot of fuzzy stuff out there. This is John Johnston with Hardcore College Football History. I hope you enjoyed this. I really appreciate any feedback you have on the format of this or what you'd like to see in these, because I am going to do an entire series on offense. And I mean all the offense. And it's going to begin with the older offenses first, which is the single wing. Please consider supporting me on Patreon. And until next time, keep studying the game.